It's just 1 minute after 11:01 here in on a lovely Minnesotan day in the beginning of the summer. And you are here for a full stack engineering or UX design. Which program is right for me? Which is to say, which program is right for you? So we're thinking why you're here is that you're interested in landing in a career in tech and you'd like some help choosing which prime program and career path is best for you. And the two programs we offer are full stack engineering and user experience design. I am going to stop sharing my screen so you can see my ugly mug. I'm Dev Jana. I'm one of the directors of instruction for the full stack engineering program. And with me today is Angie Wang. And I think she's going to pop in for a second, introduce herself, and then we'll give you folks a moment to talk.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me, Dev? Cool. I'm Angie Wang. I'm the director of UX instruction at Prime. Is there something else I'm supposed to say? Welcome. Glad to have you here. We're glad to have this discussion and talk through a little bit about what each of our fields looks like, the roles that you might serve and the things you might make, and kind of hear both of our sides of it.
Yeah, absolutely. For the next few moments, we're going to kind of go back and forth and talk you through what the opportunities are before, during, and after Prime if you decide on either one of these courses of education, and as a career path. But what we're interested in is for you folks who are joining us online, there's a comment section at the bottom of the page. Let's take a couple moments to just kind of introduce yourselves and let us know a little bit about you. That'd be very helpful.
Looks like we've got Idris, Carissa, and Jake on the call. So thank you for joining us. All right, I will take things over. Dev, does that sound good?
No objections from me.
I don't know actually how to become the main. There we go. Thanks, Dev. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about UX design. We'll start with talking about the role. Each of us will talk about the role of a UX designer and then the role of a full stack developer. And then we'll talk through, you'll hear a little bit about the technologies that each of us work with. And so you'll hear Dev and I kind of go back and forth. So we'll have the role, the technologies, the artifacts, and kind of what makes, what qualities in people we see makes a good fit in each of these fields, which is a little bit of a interesting place to go, but we'll go there. So we'll start out by talking a little bit about the role of a UX designer and try to shed some light on what it is that we do. How do I, can't advance my, there we go. Dev, if you could just, thanks, awesome. Here we go. I mean, you can Google this, obviously, yourself, but a UX is really is an advocate for the user's experience, clearly, an advocate for a user's goals, whereas we often we're thinking about business goals or technology constraints. We're inserting an understanding of the people who we're actually building and making experiences or products or tools for, and trying to adapt their lens, understand the jobs that they are trying to do, the role that they play in that system, and make design decisions that help support those goals. The whole spectrum of UX design is rather broad. So let me see if I can share my camera so you can see my face a little bit. It's a little less awkward. So the role of a UX designer is to really understand across the whole spectrum of that design lifecycle, how it's going to feel, but for the person who's using it, and how we can improve those feelings. So there's like a soft side of it. There's some research understanding the space in which that product is going, the context of use, understanding the things that people are trying to do in that space. So if we're thinking about let's think of a tool, a calculator, for instance. The design of a calculator, there's certain functionality that it needs to perform, like needs to add and subtract and be able to, type numbers and equals and maybe store some numbers in memory. But if you think about a calculator for a first grader who's learning addition and subtraction, right, looks different than a calculator for a scientist in a lab, right? And so understanding the context of make better functionality product needs. It's about even things like the interaction. So for a child, we may need larger buttons so that they can hit them easily. For a scientist, we may need a larger screen so that they can do graphing, right? So we consider the user's context across that in order to define the functionality. And then we get to do things like evaluate it along the way. So we get to kind of check the work of the team by putting it back into the hands of users and seeing how well it works. So it involves understanding the psychology of perception and interaction, being able to understand like foundational design principles and how we can use those to better match users' expectations, knowing that there's a difference between, kind of perception and perception is reality, right? So we like to actually be used by users and see, and then we see things through, hopefully in an ideal state, like all the way through to development. So we work with developers and technologists to understand the things that we're suggesting be done, how feasible are they, how creative do we need to get in reframing how things get put together so that we can, again, advocate for those users' goals, but understand the technology constraints and the business needs. So that's kind of a dynamic overview, I guess, of understanding the role of the UX designer. To summarize some of those responsibilities, or the key responsibilities that you might have when serving in that capacity in an organization or on a team, you do a lot of client interactions or product owner interactions. So you may be in-house, you may be external, you may be independent contractor. So your client kind of looks different, but you're meeting a lot with people. You're talking with users, hopefully. You are doing some testing, maybe. You're definitely producing artifacts, and we'll get into what they look like, but some design artifacts like storyboards, a lot of sketching, obviously lots of Post-its, but I think that's common across both disciplines. Doing some analysis, so synthesizing research data that either you collected or came from somewhere else, looking into research that's already been done and figuring out how to apply that to the thing that you're making, doing competitor audits, looking at the landscape around the thing which you're making and trying to understand how your thing can differentiate or leverage what's already being done really well. And then, let's see what else we got. Some titles, some job titles. So this is a rabbit's nest, I guess you would say. We actually, in the program, we send out a list of I think it's 55 terms, and it keeps growing, that people will call or label this type of work. So it's a rabbit's nest or landmine or whatever you want to call it, but there's not a lot of, I would actually venture to say there is no commonality, which is challenging, but I look at it as a huge opportunity space to kind of find your niche and find your role. But obviously you see roles for UX designer, information architect, product designer, design researcher, usability specialist, interaction designer. The list kind of goes on: design strategist, experience designer, forget user, just experience designer, experience strategist. The list kind of goes on and on, but the things that you'll see in those job descriptions are pretty common and refer to those artifacts, refer to a lot of understanding relationships and managing relationships between client and user and technology, and really advocating for that user's understanding of how things should work and trying to make the product match the user's expectations. that's kind of my overview of a UX designer and the things that they do and the role that they play. And I'm going to hand it over to Dev to talk more about full stack developer role and what that looks like.
Thank you, Angie. May I just say that rabbit's nest is one of the nicest ways to describe something. Where I'm from, we call those hornet's nests.
Oh, is that what?
It sounds so much more aggressive and dangerous.
I don't know. I have a rabbit's nest under my deck, and I don't want to deal with it, so it's scary to me. So
That sounds adorable and fluffy. I'll talk about the roles of what full stack developers mean. So the concept of a developer, I think, is pretty straightforward, and a lot of people have some sense of what that means as a computer programmer. I'm going to defer to the, I believe this is maybe a Wikipedia description, but a full stack web developer is someone who's able to work on both the front end and back end portions of an application. Front end generally refers to the portion of an application the users will see or with which they will interact. And the back end is the part of the application that handles the logic, database interactions, user authentication, server configuration, etc. There is often fog of war, as us gamers tend to talk about, or like a black box into which people think your data goes when it goes from your computer out to, say, Amazon or something like that. And the simplest way that I can think of to delineate between these terms, front end and back end, which are often, I think I'm going to do what Angie did and turn my camera on so it's a little easier to see. I believe that one of the easiest ways to kind of delineate between what is front end and what is back end, because those can seem like really like gelatinous blobs of terms to folks who aren't really familiar with the technologies, is that when you're opening, let's say, your phone and you're connecting to Amazon and you're thinking about purchasing something, your phone goes out and it talks to Amazon, and Amazon says, hey, send back what today's deals are. And then those deals are on your phone, and even if you lose internet connectivity, you still have that web page is still up, or that app is still running. So that's happening on the front end. That's what you see. That's the front of the application to you. But what happened on the back end over in Amazon servers is it checked the database to see if you're logged in, if you've looked at bicycles lately. If so, it'll probably show you bicycles. It'll probably show you the biggest deals for this holiday weekend, something like that. These are the flash sales for the day. So all that logic happens on the back end on their servers, and then it comes back to your device. And even if you lose internet connectivity, what's still running on your device is more the front end, which tends to be more visual. And you can think of that as the interface with which the user interacts with the app. And then that will take something off of your device. Oh, I really would like to buy that bicycle. And then when I click purchase, it'll leave my device, and that concept of that purchase is going to get sent out to Amazon's server and go from the front end to Amazon's back end. So hopefully that clears up that concept of like front end and back end. I know sometimes you're like, oh, developers sit at computers and drink a lot of Mountain Dew or whatever. It's totally not true. I haven't had Mountain Dew in 12 years, something like that. But we sit here and we think about stuff and we program things to make it happen. But when you hear about full stack, that means the ability to go from all the way from the device to the database and back and forth. So being a full stack developer, as it says on the slide, doesn't mean that you have necessarily mastered everything required to work with the front end or the back end, but it means that you are able to work on both sides and understand what is going on when building an application. So I'm going to bring the slides back here. I think it'll be a little bit easier to follow along with some of these bullet points. So what it says here, the responsibilities, parts of the roles are like to be able to contribute to the entire app lifecycle. I have a visual a little bit later that'll help kind of make that a little bit more concrete. But the concept is that even if you're not on the back-end team, if you can imagine a company this size of, let's say, I was going to say Yahoo, but Yahoo's probably shrinking pretty fast. I already used Amazon, Twitter, something like that. They have people who work on the front-end team, people who work on the back-end team. But a full-stack developer is usually able to work on either side of those. I've certainly worked on both sides many times in my life. Collaborate with developers, designers, sysadmins, and customers. So similar to what Angie was saying earlier, what happens a lot is you'll get information from UXers or from clients saying, hey, these are the ways that this front end needs to behave, and be able to translate that into code that solves a specific problem. I'm not going to go all the way down the list, but some of the ones that I think will likely resonate with most of the viewers are like maintaining websites, mobile-based, web-based features. I think most of us have dealt with a website that looks different on a mobile device. Maybe it looks different on your phone than it does on your tablet, than it does on your browser, on your desktop, than it does even maybe on your laptop. Changes even when you scale your window. So those are responsive web interfaces, and that's all on the front end developer. So the front end developer has to take this information from the back end and go, oh, are they on a phone? Then display this type of menu. Are they on a desktop? Then display this type of menu. You know, those are some of the things with which we will be working, like writing the nuts and bolts as a developer to actually get that the same information to display in different ways as a front end developer. Improve apps for maximum speed, often called optimization, and that can happen on both the front end and the back end. And one of my favorites on this list is, you know, employ the latest technology, because we, in like development circles, we move through technology very quickly, and there's every 3-5 years there's a new set of tech, and if you haven't set yourself up to be successful as a learner as well as an implementer, it becomes a more difficult career path. So that's one of our focuses here at Prime, and it's kind of one of those threads that you will no doubt hear about a little bit later from both myself and Angie, and from everyone involved with Prime, is like being a lifelong learner and having those skills, not necessarily with the technologies of the moment, but understanding how those technologies are applied so that you can apply that understanding and grow that understanding once you get out into the workplace is really important and really kind of central to the core of how we're trying to prepare people for the workplace. So I want to say again, like, this is a rabbit's nest, I believe. It's a bunny house is what I'm going to call it. But some of the things that, some of the job titles that we've seen people get on the way out of here are clearly full stack developer. That's kind of low hanging fruit for someone who graduates with a full stack engineering certificate, but also software engineer, web developer, back-end developer, front-end software developer, application engineer. We've had people go into mobile. We've had people go into strictly database stuff. We've had people who specialize very much in a specific piece of software. Like Salesforce is a very, very large, very kind of legacy piece of software, and going back to the concept of updating existing things. We've had some graduates go on and continue to work with that. There are so many different potential opportunities for employment as someone who has a full stack development background, because you can't work on the front end, you can't work on the back end. So for example, some of these more specialized ones like back end developer, web front end developer, we have plenty of graduates go out and work for larger companies where they're working like on a very specific part of the web interface or a very specific part of the database for a larger company. And we've also had some students go out and be a full stack developer where they're handling the entire web infrastructure all the way from the device to the database and back to the device for smaller companies. So there's a lot of different opportunities and a lot of ways that in which you can go with it. We're going to explore some of those in a little bit more depth a little bit later. But until then, I believe up next is Angie, who's going to talk about the technology and artifacts of being a UX designer.
Coming. Okay. I actually have some follow-up questions for you that, you know, I'll start to, when you look at the UX that you're seeing on the screen right now, Dev, so this is kind of like what one might call to some degree, like the full stack of UX. Dev, is there is there clear delineation across that stack when you own a piece of it, like which piece you own, or is there some kind of like bleed over into other sections, or does it depend on the team and that kind of thing?
This is the beginning to answers that I always like dislike it when I get this, but I'm totally going to say it, which is it depends. But it really does very much so on the workplace and the structure of the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
At the places that I've worked, I would say about 70% of them, there was a very clear delineation where. Yep. For any of the companies at which I've worked that were 200 or more employees, I would probably say is probably about the line. Maybe close to 100 or more employees, you would have to get authorization to cross into a different discipline. So if I was
Gotcha.
working on the front end team and it was like, oh, I have this idea for something on the back end, you'd have to submit some kind of a ticket and get some kind of authorization in order to work on it. But at my last couple jobs, which are much smaller, much more like kind of agile, like let's work on it.
Yeah.
There was a lot of ideation that would clearly float across borders. Great question.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so you're going to see, it's great because even though we work in these, different disciplines or come at technology from or experiences from different angles, there's a lot of similarity in the somewhat of the ambiguity and the it depends answer kind of coming up. So the building blocks of UX, as we're calling them here, I think even that kind of makes me we've defined them, although other people would put different labels on them. So that's why you see the explanations under each. So this is kind of looking at that full stack, of UX design, or the kind of from discovery all the way through to implementation process of design, and looking at like the different components that go into that. And so these could also be, you may see these as job titles as well. So like user researcher, information architect, interaction designer, usability analyst, visual designer. The technologies that you're working on change, as Dev mentioned, right? So the tech that we may be evaluating or trying to offer user insights towards can change quite rapidly. And so we are less focused on, we are not at all focused really on equipping people with technology skills, but rather the skills to approach any kind of technology and to design in any medium and evaluate designs in any medium. So we're a medium agnostic program with a focus on digital, clearly, but we get into experiential design, multi-touch point design, so looking at design from iPad, interactive TV, physical space, that kind of thing. But these kind of components are sort of present in all of those experiences. So doing some research and understanding what people need, putting some structure into that, and understanding like language and taxonomies, and creating structures that make sense for a user as well as a business. Looking at interactions, be it between people, people and devices, sometimes devices and devices. Looking at how usable that is for people in their context, and then also understanding the visual communication components and making sure that those are being leveraged effectively. I feel like I had something else to say here. It'll probably come to me. So the reason why I was asking Deb about the stack and like where those kind of, are there silos and is there bleed over? So while we're teaching and programmatically touching upon all of these components, we are definitely looking to have and working with students to help them identify and self-assess like an area that they feel they can really own. And that's a challenge in the field because you are somewhat getting a generalist education here, but we want to help you identify a specialty or an area that you really enjoy, so that you can tell a clear story when you go out into the field and you're looking for roles. So sometimes it's like, again, these titles will change, but kind of understanding these definitions and like which parts really draw you. I really love structure. I really love language and putting order to things. So like that might put you in an information architect category, but you're likely going to have a little bit of lead over into like what comes before you and what goes after you, so that you can do your job effectively. So it's really important, just like in a full stack software program, to understand like the whole stack, to know the impact of the decisions that you're making, how they influence the things that'll happen in the future, and how things may go backwards, that kind of thing. So these are less about the technologies and more about kind of those different components. And there's obviously different software tools that we use in there. Like we use a program called Sketch, a program called Axure for prototyping, a program called Envision. We have students who use Adobe products. That's also a possibility. We use a lot of presentations and Keynote and PowerPoint. So those are some of the software programs that you use, if that's of interest to you. Of interest to know, I guess I should say. Next slide. Let me just share my face there. So so some of the artifacts that we produce totally varies. And honestly, if I could get away from creating any artifact to some degree, and depending on the role that you're in, the artifacts can somewhat get in the way. I've worked on teams where I get to work side by side with a developer, and I don't have to document the things that I'm proposing or saying or finding. Rather, I can actually just like turn to the person next to me and say like, hey, I'd love to try to do this. And they say, oh, I know a framework that we can use that'll do that. And it'll allow me to do this even quicker. And that's, one example of a relationship. But then there's, roles in large organizations, as Deb was mentioning. And we've seen grads, everything from a, 2-person shop to Fortune 100 companies. In those kinds of situations, there's a lot of, paperwork or bureaucracy or processes in place that are a little bit behind the times of technology, and so it requires us to create artifacts sometimes that may have been easier communicated by a face-to-face conversation. But that said, the power of a sketch, being able to use your hand, pen and paper, whiteboard marker, and communicate something visually rather quickly is really helpful. We do a lot of sketching in the program. You can see some examples on the screen here of, photo studies, boards to identify some insights, mapping out a process diagram, using just Post-its, and that document could be digitized if need be, but it was a artifact to keep the process moving forward. So it was not important to make it look any different than it did. We see persona documents that help everybody kind of rally around a user's needs. So there are varying fidelity of things that we make. Let's maybe go to the next slide here. Do a lot of here again, you see sketching, storyboards, wireframes, all the way through to very high fidelity comps, which is, can be a great skill to have, but if you're thinking about actual sustainability and wanting to make a product, it can be, sometimes again, a necessary evil, but it would be way better if you could just collaborate face-to-face and make that thing hand-in-hand with the developer. But we need to be able to understand how to work in a variety of fidelities, low fidelity being sketching or paper prototyping what would be a digital experience, and high fidelity meaning a really close simulation of what the final product would look like. And we use those tools and those fidelities for different reasons, to communicate to stakeholders slightly differently, to present a different face to a client, or to get feedback from a user in a way that makes them feel like something's still unfinished and they can provide feedback. So that's why we might use those different modes of communication strategically in order to keep the process moving forward. I don't think I have anything else to say on that. I'm sure we'll get some questions, but I'll kind of pass that over to Dev to talk a little bit more about the artifacts from his end and the technology.
Cool, thanks, Angie.
Mm-hmm.
So what's on the screen right now is really what we call the conceptual stack. Pardon me. I was in the middle of taking a sip of coffee when Angie passed me the ball. I was like half a second away from being ready to talk. So,
sorry, Dev.
You owe me one. So what you're seeing here is really kind of the device on the far left, the front end. So that's that little block with the top there, almost kind of looks like a South Park character, is really supposed to be representative of your browser. So on the far left where it says front end HTML, CSS, that's your browser. And then the client is the scripts that are thinking when you touch a button on your device, or when you're scrolling up and down, and it doesn't have to go and talk to Amazon or Google or something like that, but that's what's happening on your device. And then you see these arrows that kind of loop out to like the server, and then one loops back. That's where the magic of the internet happens, and your device goes and it talks to someone else's computer. I hate to be a crusher of dreams, but there is no cloud. The cloud just means it's someone else's computer. So every time you upload something from like a picture from your device, let's say to your Google Drive or to Dropbox or something like that, or to Flickr or something like that, in your browser or in your app on the front end, you're choosing the device, or you're choosing the picture, I'm sorry, and then you select maybe multiple ones, and that's the client here. That's the client that is like, oh, they've selected them on this front end. They've selected a bunch of them. And then you click, okay, let's save those to my Google Drive or to Hulu's picture saving thing or something, whatever that is. So that's this request that goes out over the internet to the computer in Amazon's warehouse in Vegas or something, and that receives those pictures. It goes, okay, I've got these pictures. They are from so and so, and I'm going to save the information into my database so that it'll exist until someone deletes it. And then it comes back to the server and says, oh, that was saved to the database. That sends it back to your device. The device goes, oh, okay, thank you for telling me that. That was saved correctly. Now I'm going to let the user know, and this is when we get that quick little like pop-up that says your pictures are uploaded successfully or something like that. So our like as a user, what we see is like we've only interfaced with all of this information, all this technology right here on the front end. We've touched a few pictures, we've clicked save, then it goes into this black hole and it comes back here. And at each one of those steps is a different type of technology. It's a different type of like almost a different philosophy of programming. And currently the technologies with which we are using here at Prime are HTML, CSS for the front end, JavaScript, jQuery, AngularJS, and React for the client side. The client side logic is where a lot of the velocity in the industry is happening. So that's an area where we're going to touch on the major ones and make sure that everyone is comfortable with them as much as they can be. Node, and I should have added Express to this picture. Node and Express we use on the server, and we use two different types of databases, SQL and Mongo. So you're getting a lot of exposure in just the 20 weeks if you decide that full stack developer is the right path for you. You're getting a lot of exposure to different ways to expose what a problem is, and then find and plan like your approach to that. I say a lot that what is a program? A program is a solution to a problem. So it's best to know your problem really well and understand. I'm sorry, I should not have moved forward yet. It's best to know your problem as well as you can, and then understand at what point in the stack it is. Is it on the device? Is it what the device is thinking about? Is it over on the server and what the server is thinking, or is it something that needs to be saved or retrieved from the database, or maybe changed or updated or deleted in the database? And once you understand where you are in the stack, it will help you determine how your approach will be to that, as well as with what technologies, potentially with what languages you will be working. So some of the artifacts that we have, this is actually a screen cap of me working on a project for some students yesterday, maybe 2 or 3 days ago. Artifacts are super important because we move so fast in technology. I've gone back to things that I've written sometimes just a week later and been like, I don't know what I was doing here. And so some of the larger ones are the code itself, the coding standards. This is something that's that's becoming very ubiquitous in the industries. We'll have coding standards, what we often call a style guide for our developers at most of the places at which I've worked. So project scopes is the concept of like, well, what is the project itself? If you just sit down and you start developing right away, it's very often you don't really have as good of an understanding of the problem and of how your data is going to interface with the user without sitting down and planning it out. A lot of times in discussions like this, I'm going to turn my camera on because I think it's in the last slides. This will probably come across a lot better in like one-to-one like facial communication. A lot of times people think like, oh, I just need to work harder at the programming, and usually it's understanding your problem better that is the barrier to getting your program to work the way that it should, which is one of the, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, the intersection of roles, which is one of the ways that someone in UX or someone with a UX background, or just even having a separate perspective than you sitting there working for 6 hours straight, can help you get to the solution to the problem, a more elegant solution. One of the things that I find very, very helpful is the documentation from other people, that artifact of like, this is what I was thinking about when I wrote this. Well, here's a very relevant example in my life. I have a one wheel. I don't know if anybody is familiar with that. It's basically like a big motorized skateboard that goes like, I got it up to a new high speed of 17 miles an hour yesterday. I probably should not have been going that fast at night, but I had a lot of fun. And it comes with an app that tracks how fast you're vehicle is going, your one wheel, and also how far it's gone totally, the engine and battery heat and stuff like that. And it's a decent app, but it doesn't do everything that I want it to do. And with a little bit of digging, I was able to find an actual open source alternative that gives me much more control over my like basically hoverboard, skateboard thing, and also is contributed to by hundreds of other developers, or maybe not hundreds, but definitely dozens of other developers. And when you have that many people working on a single code base, the artifacts that are in the document and that are in the code itself, actually looking through the code, I can see what problems people were trying to address at any point in time, becomes really, really helpful. So on that front, I think that a lot of people think that the development itself is the most important thing. The product itself will speak for itself, but very often it takes some artifacts outside of that to make things work. One thing I would encourage you to consider is when you first pick up an app or you first open a program on your computer, how do you know where to go for help? You know, and a lot of times that comes down to a mixture of UX and developers working together, which was not really a planned segue, but it's a pretty decent segue to the intersections of roles, about which I will allow Angie to kick us off.
Oh yeah, thanks. No, that was a great segue. And actually, I think you talked about artifacts so nicely. I'd like to just, I think I went on a little bit of a rant anti-artifact. I'm not anti-artifact, and in fact, I think we share a very similar goal about understanding the problem better. And often the materials that UXers are creating are to help people understand what they know about the problem, and so and communicate what they think would be an informed approach to addressing it. And so that often comes developers, or go to product owners, or go to or users or business analysts, and clear annotations and what might be commenting in the on the developer side in the code. It comes out as annotations and clear rationale for design decisions in any documents that UXers are producing. So there's that shared understanding of, or that shared goal of like trying to understand the problem better and be smarter and more efficient, and make a more meaningful product. So I'll share, let me see here. So okay, I'm sharing my screen. Everybody can see that? So these, the two roles here, you can kind of see a little bit of a diagram about how these two roles may interact. And again, this totally depends on the organization. But if you think about it, like just quite simply, so you heard about the full stack from Dev and talking through like what you see on an app, and you heard me talk a little bit about that full stack of UX, of understanding a problem and helping identify what functionality a thing should have and why it should exist, and what it does for the users. They really, looking at the text here, they really overlap in that front end space. So the thing that a user sees, if we're talking about digital products, digital experiences, that's where they like most technically overlap. Of course, if we didn't scope the product right, or we didn't define the functionality properly, and we didn't build it to support that experience that the users need, then all things kind of break down. But a kind of full UX life cycle would start over on the left with like identifying the problem space, understanding the industry, the users, the context, which helps to inform, which can lead into some really low fidelity prototypes that even could be concept tested with users in order to help define the scope. And scope can come from, from business as well. But if we're looking at this from a developer standpoint, that's kind of where there should be some conversation started. I think like the discovery research at the very front end of that, I shouldn't say front end, at the very early beginnings of a project is it can be kind of owned individually, I think. But I would welcome Dev's contradiction there. But I think like once we start to get into prototyping, I see that these two roles, a developer and a UXer, should really start to interact. So maybe, I don't know, Dev, if you want to talk a little bit about that kind of, and maybe even in an agile setting, how that evaluation and refinement and building kind of happens.
Absolutely. So there's, first of all, thank you for welcoming my contradiction. Most people don't put it so politely. But there's something that's very Googleable called the software development lifecycle, which is very similar to this. And it's really kind of that circle of like scope, evaluate, refine, build, deploy, and kind of, you never really leave that area
Mhm.
in the modern software development world. So one of the things that I ask people all the time, and if anybody here decides to join us as a full stack development student, you'll hear me ask this in the classroom. It's like, when is Twitter ever going to be done? Or like, when is Facebook ever going to be finished? The concept of what was maybe 15, 20 years ago for sure, writing your program, finishing it, putting it on a CD and sending it out and it never changes. Those days have been long gone for almost everybody for a very, very long time. Even my Mac is always telling me, hey, there's an update for High Sierra. Do you want to install it today? And I didn't ask for it to check that. It checked the internet itself. So that's my device without me prompting it as a user. The experience here is my device is saying, hey, go talk to Apple servers and check the database to see if there is an update and come back and tell the user and then pop something up on their screen. So every aspect of almost every single device now, it lives forever. So the concept of like maintenance, I think in here, it likely loops back to evaluate and refine. And as a result, one of the things that developers start doing, and it's very natural and it's a very human thing, is we start thinking about like, oh, well, how can I make this cooler or more interesting? How can I push this a little bit farther? One of the things we do is we call that feature creep. You start creeping the features forward without making sure that the experience for the user is as good or as concise or as self-explanatory. That's a term you'll hear me use regularly, as it could be. And that's where the input from UXers becomes very, very helpful. I'll say that in my last job, was doing like augmented reality, 3D facial animation mobile apps. And we started off doing that, built on the technology that company, my previous company, had used for feature films and video games and stuff. And so the concept of bringing that into a mobile space was really hairy. We didn't know how we were going to do that. And as a result, the first couple apps had a very clunky interface. It was very difficult for people who weren't familiar with just even using a device, let alone using our technology to interact with it successfully. And it took some interactions with some clients and some interactions with a whole bunch of UXers to really be like, you can cut out these 14 things here and make it 3 clicks and a swipe, and all of a sudden, oh, that's what you're trying to show in the app. And it gets very difficult sometimes when you're, as I say, like when you're in the trenches of a program, it gets very difficult to like poke your head up and see like, am I where I need to be? And very often the guiding light from situations like that comes from, or like the, I guess guiding light would work, but like that concept of like, hey, you need to go in this direction, kind of the compass of a project often comes out of nowhere from a UX deck that would just kind of show up. So that's one of the best ways that I can explain that I can think of to explain that feedback loop. Do we have anything to add there, or should we move on to the questions?
We can move on to questions, I think, just looking at time.
Yeah. So if there are any questions, we'd encourage you to put them in on the bottom in the comment section of the page in which you're watching this, and we will address them as quickly as we can as they come up. Thank you for joining us.
So question for you, Dev.
Yep. So
how do you pick the technologies in the full stack?
That's a really excellent question. So some of them have been around for a very long time. So for instance, JavaScript has been around for a while. jQuery has been around for a very long time. They're pretty much ubiquitous. They will run on anything. A few years ago, SQL also has been around for, and I'm an old man, it's been around for quite some time, about as long as I've been around. I could probably stop sharing the screen, be a little more friendly to see my ugly face here. But so like JavaScript and jQuery have been around for quite some time, same with SQL, and they're pretty ubiquitous. Actually, we do a number of different things. Probably I'll start with like the first of the three ways I think that we that are the easiest to explain how we've picked the technologies for the full stack. Some of those are ubiquitous, have been around for a long time, and also teach a lot of the fundamentals of programming. JavaScript is a pretty I'm not sure if this is going to make sense. It's a very loosely typed language. So it gives us an opportunity to allow people to explore in a little bit more of a safe space. It's not as rigid as something like C++. which is one of the first languages that I learned, but it also is evolving. So we're using like the newer syntax. A lot of this might be like technical jargon, but I think the concept is that it is changing. So like with the ES6 syntax that we're using, which is just a couple years old, newer to JavaScript, allows us to explore like more class-based and some. I'm trying to not get too technical with it, but like it's changing. So we're although it is a foundational bed for most web technologies, it is still evolving. So it's allowing us to teach some of the newer concepts that bleed over into things like I was saying, I've done a lot of mobile development. So a lot of the iOS like Swift language, it correlates directly to some of the newer syntaxes in JavaScript. SQL was something that was brought up regularly by our hiring network. There's a lot of companies and a lot of existing code bases that use SQL. It is an inherently relational database. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but there's a specific kind of philosophy for how it works that also does a pretty good job of helping people who are a little bit more visual learners understand that. We also get so I mentioned like what is ubiquitous and what has been around for a while. Also, we get feedback from our hiring network, as I mentioned. We do a lot of research. So AngularJS a few years ago was being used quite a bit. It is still being used a lot here in the local market. React is picking up a lot of traction in the industry right now. So that's being introduced right now. And MongoDB is a different type of database. So if you consider there's 20 weeks and there's a project period towards the end of the program here, that's a lot of technologies that we're doing, that we're addressing in there. But we're also doing stuff like unit testing, some front end frameworks that we didn't really go into there, like Bootstrap and Material. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening there. It looks like we got another question from Jake. What words of warning, advice, encouragement would you give to one completely new to the industry and HTML, CSS languages, but is eager and enthusiastic to dive in? Okay, so there's plenty of words, but I'll try to offer a couple of sentences. Don't get discouraged. I think that everyone, myself included, literally everyone I've ever known who programs has gone through these periods of like, I have no idea what's going on, and I don't know why this isn't working. And sometimes I have the full range of human emotion in like 30 seconds. Oh my gosh, this thing is broken. Why? Why am I so horrible? Oh, I forgot a semicolon, and then I hit enter. It's like, everything works, and I have a little dance party. So like, don't get discouraged when things aren't working. Very often you'll look at some source code and you'll look at your code and it just doesn't, they look the same. Why is it not working? It's usually something very, very small. And from that, I would say, like, make sure you write down when you've learned from a mistake. Something that people tend to do just inherently is like, oh, I fixed it, I'm moving on. As a developer, it becomes very helpful to be like, wait, what was that error that I got? What fixed that error? Write that down. I mean, physically write it down. Don't just like copy and paste it into Notepad. It'll stick inside of your brain a little bit better if you do that. Another thing that I would say is like, use a lot of the tools that are out there. There's a ton of like really amazing free tools that are out there. And it's easy to go down the rabbit hole. But you want to avoid the rabbit's nest. But it's easy to go down the rabbit hole when you're researching some of those. So just try and stay focused on like what the one problem is that you wanted to address. So for instance, like I was saying, I believe that programming is always a solution to a problem. The problem is I don't have a website that has links and a picture on it. Cool. Focus on that. Make a website that has links and a picture on it. Don't go down the rabbit hole trying to add animations or anything else until you've addressed that first problem. Hopefully that helps.
Unmute. Okay, are we good on questions? Just checking our text here.
I think with 10 minutes left, it's probably time to move on.
Yep, okay, we're gonna move on. All right, so with all of that in mind, I think I'm screen sharing, so hopefully you can see. We are hoping to kind of close that loop on like which of these paths might be right for you, and maybe they're still both sounding interesting. Maybe you're coalescing around one. So the last thing we're going to end on is a little bit about some of the personality characteristics, or I don't know which comes first, the chicken or the egg, the characteristic or the good fit, but some things, some like personal skills that are really needed in each of these fields. So starting with UX design, and we've, before building the program, we did research locally, and these terms and this language and the definitions of it came directly out of employer-based research. So I've been in the field for, in the field or tangentially in the field for about 15 years, and I didn't make these things up, right? These came out of research. So like a good UXer. So looking at people who are unafraid to dive in and make sense of the unknown. So comfort with discomfort, comfort with ambiguity is a challenge, right? And it's definitely a requirement, kind of really whichever point in the process you get involved, because there's always things we don't know. There's always going to be whether it be technology or the subject matter that you're working with, the types of users that you're working for, the business model that you're working within. It is new kind of almost every day. So being willing to dive in, and you get really comfortable with that at Prime. So that just happens day one. Having an open mindset and being adjustable. So flexibility is really key. And we talk a lot about having an open mind, but not an empty head. So kind of doing your homework, so to speak, quote unquote, and having a sense of like what problem space you're going into, or what things you need to, what problem you're about to tackle, but being open-minded that you might not know it all, because you definitely don't know it all, and that you can learn from those around you. A curiosity is really, really critical. So kind of like forget passion and think about curiosity. Are you curious? Do you want to like peek behind a corner? Do you want to look at what the code looks like? Do you want to learn more about what ER surgeons need when they're triaging a patient? That's not a thing they do, but or what HVAC contractors need when installing thermostats. Being curious about things that you don't know, and again, that like being willing to dive in is important. And then probably critical, and I think there's a lot of overlap here in both of these disciplines, but a sense of resilience. Our work is, we talk a lot about progress over perfection, and not being focused on putting our heads down and getting something perfect, but rather popping our heads up and getting feedback. So we are more often than not, putting artifacts in front of people, artifacts that are unfinished, unrefined, in progress, incomplete, in various stages of fidelity. Maybe you're not the best sketcher, but you have to put sketches in front of somebody. And so being able to withstand like criticism, knowing that it's not about you, it's about the thing that you're all kind of focused on. And, I don't even think of it as really needing to have a tough skin, because it's not a criticism of you. It's not a critique of you or your values, but you do have to undergo and involve yourself in feedback and critique on things that you have produced that are not complete. But if you can distance yourself from that, it becomes a very like invigorating and necessary component of the process. But it can be a challenge. So like kind of knowing that you have some resilience to start could make this a good fit. And then I'll hand it over to Deb to talk about full stack.
Thank you, Angie. So a couple of things that are here on the screen are really, really excellent. You might be a good fit for full stack development if you have patience. Definitely, it takes patience to deal with problems in general. One thing I say a lot for my students is, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. And it takes patience to get through a complex issue. Problem solving, as I said before, I think that programming is problem solving. You have to know what your problem is. You have to figure out, going to the last bullet point there, a pragmatic approach to solving the problem. And if you're patient and you have learned the right amounts of the specific technologies that can approach that problem, you'll be able to get to the finish line. Resourcefulness is the third one, and I just want to point out that means more than just researching. It means more than understanding what is in front of you. One of the main things that we are combat, might not be the right word, but one of the main misperceptions against which we are working regularly in the full stack development department is that programmers are these, people like in the first Jurassic Park who just sit there and eat Doritos and work by themselves. and or these geniuses. It's like, no, this is something that you can learn, that you can apply real world skills to which you can apply real world skills. And that means that your resourcefulness has to do more with just the technology that you're learning. That has to do with your ability to solve problems. It has to do with your ability to interact with other human beings correctly. And it specifically has to do with your ability to communicate what your problems are to other people who may have the answers. That may be one-to-one, that may be one-to-many, and it may be either of those via something as awkward as the internet. And then eventually, once you know how to solve that problem, you have to communicate to the computer how to solve that problem for other people without you even being around. So those are some of the ways that you can look at patience, problem solving, resourcefulness, and pragmatic. I'm a strong believer, as like a lifelong musician and former music educator, that whatever you feel like you lack in talent can be made up for with hard work, with actual learning. And those are some of the areas that we focus on, or upon which we focus here. So I think both are pretty smart choices, and I think Angie's going to talk to us about some of the workplace realities of these.
Okay, Dev. So I'll handle the money part. So both of them are great choices. And, actually, you'll probably see, like we've mentioned, there's a lot of overlap and intersection between these roles. Dev and I mean, I've done coding back in my day before I became not like the internet blew up and I had to focus somewhere. Dev's done design. So we both have some empathy for, each other's disciplines, and which is why I think it's a great conversation we're having today. But, in terms of like the practical reality of each of these career paths, they're both largely in demand. They're both high paying. We have some, am I sharing? Okay. So we have some statistics of prime overall. So I think we have about 600, correct me if I'm wrong, Dev, around 600 grads collectively. And the average starting salary of all of those grads who are placed is around $55K per year, annual salary. We also see students very quickly get their second and third jobs and kind of propel them into significant career trajectories that are very financially soluble. Is that the word? I don't know. They pay off, right? So I should not be making up my words on these slides because I don't know money financial language. But also I just saw yesterday. So if you look at any kind of workforce statistics or salary guides that are out there and published, UX designer is a growing field. So it is small but growing insanely, and there are I think there's one undergraduate program in it. There's a couple specialized programs at a master's degree level, and there are a few boot camps. We're the only option in the Twin Cities, and so we're not competing against kind of traditional career paths, which is interesting, and it's this growing field. So people really need to get educated up to speed, which means that actually there was a guide published for 2018 that it is the fastest growing salary, is one of the career paths that has the fastest growing salary. And both of them are in demand locally. So, nearly 300 positions for jobs within the UX space in Minneapolis, and that depending on the terms that you search or what you'll find more or less. And full stack developers, looking at web developers, obviously a vast amount of those locally. We've got an 85% placement rate for prime grads collectively, again, but we see, a number. We had our most recent UX cohort had 4 grads placed within 6 days of graduation, all at different, or 2 at the same org, but all at different organizations otherwise. So we see, those numbers, obviously there's fluctuations, but that's an average of all of our grads overall, with including everybody. So even people who have somewhat decided to kind of stop looking or have taken some small jobs on the side. Anything else? So I'll hand that over to Dev to talk about like the kind of nitty gritty about applying.
Sure, because I'm all about the nitty gritty. So we've got some upcoming cohort deadlines. So the application deadline, June 3rd for UX. We've got the 15th for full stack. Hey, that's a picture of the cohort, of me with the cohort with whom I just graduated. I didn't know, I forgot that was in here. So the way that full-time works, I'm sorry, the way that full stack works is very similar to the way that UX works. We have this part-time study at home for, I believe it's 6 weeks for both programs, and then an on-campus, what we call tier 2, which is the heavy instruction part that's followed by the project period. So you'll see the start dates are pretty close, and then the graduation for the next UX cohort is just before Halloween, and the graduation for the next full stack cohort is just after Thanksgiving. But these are coming up very quickly. June 3rd is just around the corner, and June 15th is also coming up very fast. So if you are interested, we have a open house coming up on next Wednesday. So you can meet some current students, tour the campus. You can RSVP at primeacademy.io/tour. I would encourage you to do that. Go ahead and do that right away. And also that night, I believe we also have an HTML, CSS workshop from, I believe, 6 to 9 or something like that. And it looks like we do have a question for you, Angie, here. What are example problems UX students are solving for at Prime? Perfect segue into our next questions.
So, gosh, I got a very good question. A number of things. So we've got chronic pain management applications that help healthcare providers better communicate with their patients, and looking at mobile apps for that. We've got a case study coming up looking at, well, that one gets into some dicey territory. Let me skip that one. Trying to think of things that aren't super polarizing at the moment. Gosh, this is I have a whole plethora of projects and I can't think of them right now. Last week we did some usability testing for the Greater Twin Cities United Way and for Foodsby. So looking at the key tasks on those sites and some problematic areas or some like roadblocks for customers, and did some in-lab testing and some remote testing of those sites, and then did some prototype recommendations for those two clients. We've worked with Make It MSP to look at how to bring new tech talent into the Twin Cities and looking at like kind of interactive campaigns that are multi-touch point. Right now we're working with an organization that produces a collar for high school football players who, and their collar kind of reduces the impact after the head movement after impact, and they're designing a trade show experience. So that has interactive TV and an iPad and some physical components. So they're creating a design strategy for that, which is pretty complex work. We've had students who have worked on, get a lot of things in the medical space. So mental health, healthcare for young college women, and an application to assist with that. Yeah, gosh, kind of everything across the board. So we do, I'll just quickly mention that we do, in those first 6 weeks of classroom at Prime, we do weekly case studies. So we kind of tackle design from we plop students in at a different part in the process and have them kind of work forward from there. And so we do a lot of like client meetings and different types of prototyping. So interactive prototyping or sketch prototyping, and always some primary and secondary research. So always some research with users, and always some research, like some desk research that you can do rather cheaply, quote unquote, so that it keeps you nimble as a resourceful, as Dev would say, when you get out into the workplace, that you don't need to do kind of like fly around the country and do expensive research. You can do some at your desk. So yeah, great question. I wish we had a portfolio of all the projects they've worked on. There's, probably, so we do 5 projects per cohort, and then during tier 2, and then in tier 3, we do about 4 or 5 more. So we've probably got about 50 projects that the UXers have worked on.
Nice, including the downtown improvement district.
Yeah, downtown improvement district, looking at Nicollet Mall. So we like I said, we do things that are medium agnostic and can be very like multiple touch points, kind of experiential, spatial, but also down to like mobile apps for healthcare providers.
So it looks like we've got time for one more question, and the next one that came up is, what is an example of picking the right technology for a problem or project? A lot of this comes down to what the needs are of your client, what the needs are of your users. I can give a very specific example of one of the ways that we would choose, like, let's say like a database. I mentioned we use both SQL, which is inherently relational. I'll try to explain that as quickly as I can, and MongoDB, which is not, which is a little bit more loose. It allows you to kind of work with it pretty quickly. With something like SQL, the database, you can think of it as like a spreadsheet. It's like tables. And we can write things that like smush those tables together. They're called joins, actually. And if that is a bit of functionality that we're going to need regularly, like we've got a lot of different tables, we want to smoosh these together really quickly, and we want it to behave very quickly, maybe run as fast as possible on a number of older browsers, then we might choose something like jQuery with SQL. If it's something that we know is going to be mobile first, we might choose to do React, and we might even choose to do what's called React Native, which is specific for a mobile device, and then use something like Mongo a little bit. We might choose to use Mongo for something that's going to be non-relational, where it's just a bunch of information. We're just going to grab the newest stuff, or let's say the last like 30 things in a feed, as they say for like Twitter or something like that. So those are some really quick examples. I think Angie has something else to add before we kind of close up shop for the day.
Since I was fumbling so much, I feel like I needed time to think of my project. So a couple things that also came to mind, like looking at an app for foreign language teachers. So there's a student side and a teacher side. So assessments of students learning a second language, changing platforms, looking at new interaction models for debate platforms, which is super timely, given all the kind of stuff that's happening on the internet now, and conversations that are pretty polarizing. Think about how to change that interaction model and create a new type of platform that sort of brings data to the fore. And then we've also done some stuff in these are all rather recent cohorts, looking at software for police officers that's used to track cases and do some kind of like internal tools. So there's like internal tools, some tools used that are optional, and then some kind of like brand new experiences that are sort of open for everyone. So thank you for letting me share some additional examples. So I'm not just like, oh, I don't know, there's so many. So I just wanted to give some more tangible examples.
Cool. With that, we're a little bit after noon o'clock. I almost said noon o'clock. So thank you for stopping by. And if you've got any other questions, I think you can drop them in there. We'll try to address them. If you feel like sticking around for a little bit longer, we hope to see you at the open house campus tour and HTML CSS workshop next Wednesday. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.